I'm presuming most people are broadly familiar with Operation Julie. If not, ask me afterwards or pick up that information sheet there. But Operation Julie is one of the defining events in British psychedelic history, and 2017 is the 40th anniversary of those events, so I wanted to mark it in some way. And today I'm going to focus on one of the Operation Julie gang and his journey through the Operation Julie events. Who is it? Well, I've been fortunate enough to have interviewed Andy Munro, the chemist at the London lab at Seymour Road. I've also had conversations with Leif Fielding, the major distributor of the acid made at the Seymour Road lab. And I've had conversations with Richard Kemp, the acid chemist genius, who in Wales produced some of the best LSD the world has seen. But the person through whose eyes I'm going to try and reflect key events and aspects of the Julie story is Alston Hughes, better known to everyone as Smiles. But first, does anyone know what that is? No, we'll come back to it later. Yeah, Smiles were one of the major distributors of Operation Julie LSD, and interspersed with Smiles' story, I'm going to be mentioning some lesser known and intriguing snippets of information surrounding the Operation Julie events, as well as giving my opinion as to why the British government chose to waste, some might say, hundreds of thousands of pounds trying to stop people choosing to alter their consciousness in accordance with their will. So, although the prosecution painted the Operation Julie defendants as heartless, profit-driven drug traffickers, destroyers of the young minds and all that's good about the Daily Mail version of Britain, the truth is actually quite different. And yes, of course, people did make money from the manufacture, distribution and sale of the Julie acid. In some cases, they made lots of money. But so what? Even psychedelic ideologues are surely allowed to make a profit. And this profit was more than balanced out by the immense pleasure, freedom and societal deconditioning and other benefits Operation Julie acid conferred on the vast majority of those who took it. And it's worth bearing in mind also that whatever your opinion of LSD, no government-sponsored scientific study has ever been carried out in Britain to determine if it is actually physically or mentally harmful. No deaths were directly attributed to the Operation Julie acid, and admissions to hospital in the mid-70s for people with problems caused by LSD were very, very, very low indeed when compared to other drugs. So before we sort of go into Operation Julie first, just indulge me for a moment in some scene setting in which I'll show you how, years before Operation Julie was conceived, the state, the establishment's in fact, and we'll come back to that word later, the establishment's mindset was dead set against the use of psychedelics for personal use. As early as the summer of 1966, before LSD was made illegal and when it was barely known about in Britain, Lord St John made this statement about LSD in the Houses of Parliament. No drug has been produced which has caused greater trouble in this world than LSD, and that was in June 1966. Well, you might be thinking, well, what the fuck's that about? There was no evidence. Where is his evidence? There isn't any evidence. Never has been, never will be. Unless, of course, you count the cultural evidence and the mounting fear in the British establishment at the time that, as Bob Dylan said, there's something happening here and you don't know what it is, Mr. Jones. And something indeed was happening, because not many months after Lord St John made his asinine comments about LSD, thousands of young people across Britain were turning onto acid, tuning into its message and dropping out of a society they were increasingly seeing as antithetical to their aspirations. And the establishment, with a capital E, didn't like that idea one bit and decided that if LSD were illegal to possess, the problem might go away. And so it was made illegal in September 1966. It didn't go away. Now, I use the word establishment throughout this talk, and by that I mean establishment with a capital E. And people often say to me, you know, where's the proof that there was a consistent and determined effort by the establishment to drive LSD and the cultures it spawned out of existence? Now, you can't go to the National Archives at Kew and pull a file off the shelf saying how we destroyed LSD culture, because that doesn't exist, because the establishment doesn't work that way. It's not solely comprised of the political party in power at any given time, nor is it the underlying administration which supports the political party. The establishment with the capital E is much, much larger than that. And my interpretation of it is in the way that Spectator journalist Henry Fairley interpreted it in 1955, which is, by the establishment, I do not only mean the centres of power, although they are certainly part of it, but rather the whole matrix of official and social relations within which power is exercised. The exercise of power in Britain, more specifically in England, cannot be understood unless it is recognised that it is exercised socially. So it's basically the old boys club, what you know, who you know, what you're trying to protect. And, you know, really it's more about the connections between people of certain politics, status, power, wealth and position than it is about explicit laws. But let's get back to Smiles. Yes, he was a major dealer of the Operation Julie acid. He was shifting hundreds of thousands of trips a week. But it was a dealer with conviction and with conscience, because like it had done for so many of those who took it later, Smiles' life was fundamentally changed by his early acid experiences in the 1960s. And here he is talking about what acid did for him and what effectively motivated him to go into the business.
I felt empowered by LSD because it made me see that it didn't have to be the way it was or appeared to be, and that you could actually please yourself. You could get rid of the crap that was holding you down, the conditioning. I mean, that's the big thing, was the deconditioning that LSD brought. That's, yes.
So basically, that was his position, and it seemed to be exactly this deconditioning effect of LSD that the establishment feared the most. The last thing a post-war manufacturing and consumer-driven society wanted was people choosing not to fall for the birth, school, work, death, know your place, don't try to live differently or think for yourself kind of society. Because really, when all's said and done, the establishment wants the masses to be mindless flesh drones who will suck up whatever is fed to them as education, to slave for their lives in order to generate profit for other people, and who will mindlessly consume anything suggested to it by TV or other increasingly sinister means of suggestion. And so, after many adventures in the world of drugs prior to his involvement in Operation Julie, sometime in the early 70s, Smiles became a major distributor of Operation Julie acid, and at the time he was living in a place called Llanddewi Brefi in mid-Wales. Now, many of you will know that as being from the Fast Show where the only gay in the village lived. Well, prior to that, Smiles was the only dealer in the village. And at that time, in the mid-1970s, was the heartland of the hippie diaspora from the cities, and there Smiles was moving large quantities of acid and making a reasonable living in doing so. And there's a misconception as well about Operation Julie, that because lots of them lived in Wales, everyone knew each other and what they were doing. Now, that wasn't the case. Not until after the busts anyway. Operation Julie's setup was one of a need-to-know basis. It was a highly structured, compartmentalised system. Pickups and drop-offs of produce and money were done by exchanging carrier bags in pubs, or digging things up in woods and so on and so forth. And the whole conspiracy was compartmentalised in a way that most criminals, at least in those days, weren't capable of. And as an example, Smiles lived in Llanddewi Brefi, and he was shifting tens of thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands of trips a week. 3 miles down the road in Tregaron, Richard Kemp was making high-quality acid. But the acid that Smiles was dealing came from the London lab, and he had no idea that Kemp was making acid 3 miles down the road. That's how clever it was all set up. And also, it was dealing networks dealing in massive amounts of drugs and massive amounts of money, but completely on trust. And this should be Smiles talking about that.
The whole thing was done on trust.
Yeah.
You have to remember that, I'd be given 100,000 trips at a time, £27,000 worth of merchandise, and I'd pay for it when I'd sold it.
Yeah.
So, that kind of trust doesn't usually exist within the criminal
fraternity. And of course, the Llanddewi Brefi locals had no idea what was going on. Just that Smiles and his chums, who were all sort of hardcore hippies, appeared in the town, in the village, lived there and had loads of money. But they weren't your typical back-to-the-land hippies who kept themselves to themselves and who the locals often feared. Smiles and his chums were in the local pub every night, and they were splashing their money around. Smiles would think of nothing of buying rounds for people in the pub all night. If some of the locals were on their, in a state of destitution, money or groceries would appear magically on their doorsteps. He gave people money to renovate cottages and so on. It was a very, very generous person. If that's what the prosecution in the Operation Julie trial meant by profit-driven criminals, then I think they needed to comprehend the notion of basic humanity and of hippie philanthropy, basically doing random acts of kindness undertaken with no thought of reward. And indeed, to this day, there are locals in Llanddewi Brefi who have suggested, only half in jest, that Smiles was the modern-day equivalent of the Welsh Robin Hood, Tum Sion Cati, and that a statue of Smiles should be erected in the village square. And indeed, Tim Leary himself referred to dealers as, the dealer is the new Robin Hood. And even now, if you go to the pub in Llanddewi Brefi and you start to ask about Smiles and people, the locals won't hear a bad word about him. But this human element in those who make, sell or use psychedelics, LSD, is rarely reported in the media and is certainly never taken into consideration in court trials. And nor was this acid philanthropism confined solely to Smiles. Richard Kemp, the chemist making Operation Julie acid a few miles away in Tregaron, told police after his arrest that he donated lots of money to what he called head politics, meaning organisations such as Release, free festivals and so on and so forth. So again, the prosecution and media depiction of the Julie gang as heartless money-making fiends is somewhat disingenuous, but then a News at 10 headline saying that acid heads have been helping not only their own culture, but their Welsh neighbours would rather have devalued the message the establishment was trying to get across. Now, I mentioned free festivals just then. These days we have the likes of Glastonbury and the other corporate money-making events, which are basically the original free festival idea, commodified, monetarised and sold back to those who want to belong to that sort of thing. Basically, as I see it, they're the modern-day equivalent of Butlins holiday camps for hipsters and wannabe hippies. Yeah. But back in the 70s, the free festival scene was very different indeed, and it's here where I'd like to introduce my theory as to what initiated and drove the Operation Julie police operation. Pre-Operation Julie, LSD had fundamentally changed the lives of hundreds of thousands of people in Britain, and so much so that a very specific LSD culture had arisen. And this wasn't the Carnaby Street or the London sort of television version of hippies. This was a grassroots emergent tribe who were choosing to live radically different lives to the average British citizen. Squats, communes, shared houses, even whole streets in some towns and villages became the focus of this growing acid-driven community, which was centred on sharing, fun, music, love, peace, community, spirituality, and of course getting high. The early 70s also the rise of this tribe's exodus from the cities to small villages and the countryside, and became a large but as yet not historically well documented back to the land movement, and they produced things like this, you know, go on, phone in sick, go to a free festival instead. And of course many people did, people bought buses, cars, and they just went off. So starting with Glastonbury Fair in 1971, between May and October each year, there were an increasing number of multi-day free festivals where people lived and celebrated their psychedelic culture. Stonehenge, Watchfield, the Meagan Fairs, the Trentish Show Fairs, and many others became established events, to the point whereby, by about 76, 77, if you wanted to be, you could be in a free festival every day for the entire summer between May and October. And a vast number of people who were starting to make their living from trading at these events, buying and selling food, clothes, services, and of course, LSD. Now, this didn't go unnoticed by the establishment, and samples of the high-quality LSD being bought by undercover police at free festivals were being sent to the British government's Central Drugs Intelligence Unit based at Aldermaston, and they noted that a very high-quality LSD was on the increase, and although it appeared in several forms and colours, it appeared to have just one or two possible sources. And this was the genesis of the drive by Inspector Dick Lee, head of the Thames Valley Drug Squad, to set up a national drug squad to locate, arrest and prosecute those who were responsible, and that's where the term Operation Julie comes from, because one of the police women was at Julie. I just use it as a cultural shorthand for the whole thing. So it's my theory that the establishment had identified this growing free festival culture as a serious threat. That culture and acid culture generally was drawing in more and more young people each week. It was the very antithesis of the work and consumer culture, so it had to be destroyed. Now, is there any evidence for this? Well, no, again, you're not going to find a file in the National Archives, but there are files in the National Archives that explain how they crushed the Windsor Festival, specifically the 1904 festival. There are also things like, we know that the guy behind the Stonehenge Free Festival, Wally Hope, appeared to have been targeted by the state, incarcerated, given the chemical kosh and died. And there are many other instances where you can see the effects of the state chipping away at free festivals and the acid culture that drove it. So it's my contention that, as with the vilification of LSD in the mid-60s, the campaign mounted against the manufacturers, distributors and users of the LSD made by Operation Julie in the 70s was driven more by the fears of the establishment about the potential social effects and the consequences of widespread LSD use in society than any real concern about mental or physical health issues caused by its use. I asked Smiles for his opinion, as he was there.
I think you've hit the nail on the head, really. Yes, there was a growing movement, and more people wanted to take up a different lifestyle. And in Joni Mitchell's work, we've got to get back to the garden. And it was appealing, you know. I mean, people were becoming dehumanised by cities and industry, and the false promises of politicians. And LSD just draws the veil aside, and you understand that you've been manipulated in every which way, you know, by the mass media, by your leaders.
You think that's out of sync? It's not. Smiles has the ability to actually talk like that. As the 70s progressed, the free festivals and the surrounding psychedelic culture rapidly grew, and Operation Julie chemists were churning out hundreds of thousands of microdots of high-quality LSD on a regular basis. The acid went everywhere in the world and was ridiculously cheap at wholesale prices, and if you're buying it at point of sale, you'd be able to buy a trip for between 25p and 50p, which is the price I paid at the Windsor Free Festival in 1974, where I think part of my brain still resides. But it wasn't only hippies who were using Operation Julie acid, and one of the many rumours related to the Operation Julie events was that Princess Margaret, the Queen's sister, and her pals were frequent flyers on Julie acid. There are also rumours that the time and date of the police raids in March 1977 had to be changed because someone closely connected to Princess Margaret was in the area as someone who the establishment could not afford to be caught up in such an event. This is just one angle of Operation Julie which is yet to be explored in depth, and if evidence properly exposed, will show the astounding hypocrisy at work within the establishment. Now, when I interviewed the London acid chemist, Andy Munro, he told me the name of the guy who allegedly sold several thousand trips to Princess Margaret's intermediary. The dealer was one Doug Flanagan. If anyone knows him, I'd be pleased to hear from you. This acid was to be consumed by Princess Margaret and her mates, and quite a lot of it, along with a lot of cocaine and hashish bought from the same source, was allegedly taken out to a holiday highway on the island of Mustique. Now, who was this interesting intermediary? Well, I was told by Andy Munro that it was Princess Margaret's boyfriend at the time, Roddy Llewellyn. Is this rumour true? Well, I contacted Llewellyn about this, and he threatened to sue me back to the Stone Age, were his exact words, if I ever mentioned this allegation, and he clearly states it wasn't him, and therefore we have to accept this statement as being true. However, the facts of the matter about who told me are also true, and I'm noting them here without prejudice in the context of my historical research. Now, I'll take this further. For a time in the 1970s, Llewellyn lived on an upper-class commune near the city of Bath called Surrendell, with the likes of actress Helen Mirren, sundry low-level aristocracy, musicians like Sam Gopal, and so on. Now, Mirren, by her own admission in her autobiography, took acid at the commune, so we knew it was used there. Princess Margaret was known to visit the commune, and it was there she became romantically linked to Roddy Llewellyn, then the commune's head gardener. And of course, there were already rumours afoot that Margaret had taken acid with some of the Beatles in the 60s. Now, there's more circumstantial but interesting evidence to this rumour. On March 27, 1977, the day after the Julie bust, the News of the World, known for its unseemly rooting about in the private lives of the royal, the rich and the famous, ran a story about the raids which contained the following sentence. A detective said last night that when the matter comes to court, well-known names will be mentioned, including a friend of the royal family. And Lynn Ebenezer, who wrote 2 books, one in Welsh, one in English, on Operation Julie, a journalist, said, I can confirm that I was given information implicating her and her friend by a police officer, but the dealer that supplied her friend, was the dealer that supplied her friend ever charged for that offence? No, the dealer's name was known to the police though. And again, I'm not accusing Roddy Llewellyn, he says no. But the rumour is part and parcel of Operation Julie folklore, just like that stupid story that there were still some trips buried in a wood that was in the media last week. And the media clearly knew something, and it's tempting to suggest that they chose not to publish it, but hinted, as we'll see later, that they knew. Anyway, the careful planning of the Operation Julie intelligence gathering came to fruition on the 26th, in the early hours of the 26th of March 1977, when 87 properties were raided and 120 people were arrested. Some of the busts were really heavy-handed and involved armed police. Why? Here's Smiles giving a brief insight into what it's like to be woken by what we used to call the knock on the door in the night squad.
There's an almighty bang. And coming up from sleep, I was going to make my way out of the skylights. We lived in the roof underneath the skylights. But before I could, there was a copper had come up the stairs and he put a gun to my head and handcuffs on me, dragged me out of bed. My wife and my sister-in-law were taken away instantly, and then I was dragged around the house handcuffed to this copper with a pistol for the next 8-9 hours. All was going swimmingly. We'd been in the kitchen and they'd taken everything off the shelves and emptied out the packets. The full packets they'd taken down, put them back on the shelves, and I was quite happy about that. And then, probably about 1 o'clock in the afternoon, they had a phone call, and they said, come in the kitchen. And they took me into the kitchen, and he took down these two full packets of Alpen and said, are there drugs in here? And I said, no, there's no drugs in there at all. So they donned rubber gloves, got tweezers, and opened the packets and turned them upside down and £14,000 in notes just spread across the kitchen floor. At which point, policeman turned around and smacked me around the ear hole, and then I got a bit of a tune-up. Nothing too heavy, but, you know, a good few slaps. One of them had to be pulled off.
So as you can see, it was quite sort of a violent intrusion into Smiles's life, with armed police being dragged around and beaten up. When they got the co-conspirators all down to Swindon police station, they were interviewing them. The true context and amount of ignorance of what they knew about drugs generally came out, and this is just one little interchange. Oh no, that's just hairline. One interchange between Greenslade, the detective, and Richard Kemp, where Kemp's saying, you know, you know nothing, and you represent political repression. And then Greenslade, as you can see, is talking about, you don't know how many people are suffering from hallucinations. Well, that's why they took the drug in the first place, if indeed they had hallucinations. Kemp, again, you know nothing. Greenslade, I've travelled in the Far East and seen people on opium. Well, duh. So what's that got to do with acid? And basically, it was obvious to Kemp and to Smiles and to Munro and everyone that the police had no idea what they were dealing. They were just there to stamp down on any breach of the law. And when the trial did open on the 12th of January 1978, the prosecution opened by giving what they believed was a background history of acid, and of course this was completely skewed and would have no doubt have influenced the presiding judge, the jury and the media. And for instance, they claimed that LSD was purely a drug of abuse with no useful therapeutic uses. Now, and in those 10 words, they managed to dismiss and cancel out the work of hundreds of psychotherapists and professionals who had used LSD productively with tens of thousands of people between 1952 and the late 1960s. And the trial was conducted in a manner befitting that of a terrorist show trial or that of a secret state shotgun trial. Armed police were on the roof of the Bristol Crown Court. Defendants were ferried to and from the court in fast convoys. Maximum and frequent negative media coverage took place. You know, there was no evidence that they were connected to terrorist groups or anything. The media, the physical and media overkill told only one story, and that it wasn't that tens of thousands of people had had their mind expanded. It was that the hippie masterminds behind the worldwide LSD distribution had to be brought down. There was no way out, and any attempt by the defence to introduce sense by bringing medical professionals in to sort of say, well, you know, acid's not that harmful, was just stamped out. The law was the law, and it must be upheld. When the sentences came, obviously that's the judiciary and that's Operation Julie, they were harsh, and considering that there were no evidence that Kemp or Munro's acid physically or mentally harmed anyone, they were completely disproportionate. Hopefully you can read that. Kemp got 13 years. Well, you know, even these days you can rape someone and you can bugger a child and still get less than 13 years, and that is fundamentally wrong. Smiles got 8 years, which he wasn't happy about. Interestingly, David Solomon, who wasn't involved in the direct production or distribution, got, what did he get? He got 10 years, and that's because the state had been after him for years. He was a known drug writer, you know, he was very open about his views and everything, and I think he'd just come to the top of the list and they were going to nail him. Mark Charney, who's not listed here, received 2 years, yet he'd been a tablet courier for Kemp's acid and very well embedded at that level. And I wonder if that, well, I know it had something to do with the fact that after the arrests, but before the trial, one of the defendants, which was Charney, had told the police where a large stash of Kemp's crystal acid was under the stove in his kitchen. Only Kemp, only Charney, only Bott knew about that. Only one of those three got 2 years. You do the math. I tried to contact Charney to discuss this, but he doesn't want to talk about it. I asked Smiles why he thought the sentencing, what he thought of the sentencing, and why it was so harsh.
One certainly felt we had to be made an example of, you know, to discourage others from following this, which, you know, really goes along with the whole idea that they were afraid of a breakdown in their control. And so if they turned us into an example, others wouldn't follow. Certainly got that impression.
I'm going to have to skip some bits to finish on time, but basically one of the things I was going to talk about was how annoyed I was that although the counterculture, the hardcore hippie fraternity were happy to take Operation Julie Acid, there was no real resistance to the trial, you know, no marching on the court or anything. I find that rather sad. I think these days it would be a very different thing. I asked Smiles, would he do it again? Oh no, this is the front page of the Daily Express on the day of the when all the sentences came out. Big piece about Operation Julie, and in the top a bit about Roddy and Margaret, and a lot of the red tops, in fact the broadsheets, had similar things. It was almost as though they were saying to Roddy and Margaret, we know, and you know that we know, but we can't say it. Anyway, this was Smiles talking about whether he'd do it again. Oh, no, that Smiles been taken from court.
Yes.
Exactly the same way?
No.
How would you do it different?
I would be much more circumspect about how I went about my business, and I'd be much quieter about it. Well, I'd like to think I would, but I guess it's kind of in my nature not to. You know, what you see is what you get.
You can't be different to your nature, can you?
I try to be honest in all my dealings. And yes, I would do it again at the drop of a hat.
Okay, thank you very much, Smiles.
It's all right.
It doesn't actually end there, because when I interview psychedelic luminaries, if you like, I always ask them for sort of hints and tips about how to deal with the psychedelic experience, because you know you can always learn something new. And in discussion with Smiles at the end, I said, tell me what you've had some phenomenally high doses. What do you do if it all goes a little bit wobbly? And he said, it's simple: breathe.
Yeah,
that's where it's at. Really, I mean, on mega doses, you get breathing down to 1 a minute. It's like, you're just somewhere else.
Yeah.
And I mean, if I could live on that plateau, I would. I really would. I mean, the most sensational experience of my life, just to be there. Yeah. And it's indescribable. I mean, there isn't language for dealing with those spaces, but the experience is blissful.
So I think that sort of nails it, doesn't it? We had his saying in the beginning why he got into acid in the first place, and that was his summation of what it was all about, which I wholeheartedly agree with. Though that interview was done about 2 months ago, so it's all contemporary and up to date. And I'm sorry I couldn't entertain you more today, but if you want to find out more, there's loads of books about it. I've got loads of stuff about Operation Julie and Albion Dreaming, which was sanctioned by the London chemist, and there's some stuff in Acid Drops also. Thank you very much.